I want to start. I mean, there are many, many things to be said about Edward Thompson, and of course Dorothy, his companion for many years, who we shouldn't forget, a very independent-minded person in her own right, and very important actually for Edward's own work and his stability, which was very necessary to him. But let me do it in three chunks. Let's start with the decision in 1956, after the invasion of Hungary by an extremely misguided Soviet Union. Um, a large number of Communist Party intellectuals, young, middle-aged and old, left the party. I don't have the figures in front of me, but one of the key people in agitating that for this departure from the Communist Party was Edward Thompson. And very active, very angry. He basically couldn't take this anymore, this entire system of politics. And he and others set up a magazine called The New Reasoner, in which was effectively the magazine of people leaving the Communist Party. It offered them space, it offered them home. And I just picked up, I've got a file downstairs, I just picked up at random, literally, the summer 1959 issue. The lead article is Edward Thompson, E.P. Thompson, on the New Left. And there's so much of it which is still apposite. I begin with the opening sentence from Edward, his editorial called The New Left, quoting from William Blake. And William Blake, the quote from William Blake was written in 1810. "I'm really sorry to see my countrymen trouble themselves about politics," wrote William Blake. "House of Commons and Houses of Lords appear to me to be fools. They seem to me to be something else beside human life." Now, Blake, of course, could be very sharp, and Edward admired that sharpness, and then pointed out that this was Blake being angry, because on the next page of his notebook, he was denouncing the wretched state of political science, which is the science of sciences. But that anger and apathy towards these institutions of the British state, of course, exists today as we gather here to mark Edward's the centenary. I mean, these millions of people, young and old, who've been marching up and down the streets of Britain on Gaza and calling for what? For a ceasefire, that's all, are being rejected, denounced, reduced, pressure put on them by the government and by the opposition, because Starmer is expelling a lot of Jewish members of the Labour Party who don't happen to agree with Netanyahu. So I was seriously reading this morning. I thought, how many of these young folk who've been on the demonstrations, and many of us older folk too, will vote for the Labour Party, which is a question Edward raises in this first piece. Again, it depends, I guess, on which constituency. I mean, my own position was decided by the fact that I'm in a very unfortunate location, because my member of parliament actually is Keir Starmer, which makes the decision very easy for me. But you know, I think other people will have problems. And of course, the huge exodus of intellectuals and activists from the Communist Party led to a very big layer which played a major part in the formation of the campaign for nuclear disarmament, in which Edward was heavily involved, and that too had a fight and led to a big fight in the Labour Party. A Labour Party which at that time didn't expel everyone who the leadership disagreed with. Anyway, the CND won the leadership and then had to be displaced. So there is some similarity. But then Edward quotes from Tommy Steele, a singer of that time, who I think only the grey and white heads would probably remember, in his song Doomsday Rock, which he calls. Edward says that Tommy Steele anticipated someone else by several years in writing the appropriate hymn for NATO. NATO is now a sort of much worshipped sector of global militarism and supported by all the political parties in this country, all of them, including the SNP. Probably Plaid doesn't, but I'm not sure about that. And so Tommy Steele is quoted here by Edward Thompson, and he says, "The first day there'll be lightning, the second there'll be hail, the third day break there'll be a big earthquake, so brother, forward my mail. Rock and roll, you sinners, sing to save your soul. There ain't no room for beginners when the world is rock and roll." And then ending, "The fourth day there'll be darkness, the last time the sun has shone. The fifth day you wake up and say, the world's really gone." And this mood which gripped Britain and other parts of Europe, but not to the same extent as Britain, you can see repeated in the anti-war movement today. That with all the talk of so-and-so's got nukes, will Israel use nukes? Will we use nukes to defend Israel? Has Iran got the nukes? So Edward's argument, many years after this particular piece that he wrote, was in a piece he wrote for the New Left Review, opening up a new debate on END, European nuclear disarmament. And the big text that he wrote was called Exterminism, in which he argued that when nuclear weapons spread the way they are doing, it's out of control almost, because sooner or later, some so-and-so in the leadership of these countries, whatever it is going to use them. And therefore it is in our combined interests to stop the spread and growth of nuclear weapons. Because once, and I think they have reached this point. And I was once debating Donald Rumsfeld's leading advisor, legal advisor at the Pentagon, during the height of the Iraq War, soon after it. Her name was Ruth. I'm trying to remember her second name now. She is on the platform of this big Sunday morning debate in Berlin. She said to the audience, which was 100% Germans, I'm really shocked that you Germans are scared of war. And the entire audience, I exaggerate not, went, "Oh."
Oh my God.
Afterwards I had to have lunch with her, and actually she turned out to be more intelligent than that. And the question she asked me is, Edward Thompson dead? He is dead, isn't he? So I got the shock of my life. This lady from the Pentagon is asking me about Edward. I said, yeah, he died sadly some time ago. I said, how do you know him, Ruth? And I think it was Ruth Wedgwood, yeah. And so she said, Oh, I was in London in the 60s and used to hang around the New Left Review and DND, and I heard Edward speak, and what a delight it was. And I said, Ruth, I hope you don't mind my saying so, but you appear to have learned very little from me. And she laughed and said, well, we all change. I mean, I know you don't, but we all do. And so I think changing the question of saying what the world is like, what was going on. And we talked a lot about Edward, but then she showed that she had learned something, or at least to a certain extent. I said to her that Clinton and Madeleine Albright came quite close to reuniting the Korean Peninsula, but your lot, the Bushies, and your present government in the States seems to have completely pulled back from the reunification of Korea. I said, surely it would have ended one more unnecessary division, Cold War division. And she said, you know something, you think it would. I said, well, it's obvious that they wouldn't fight each other at least. And she said, no, just think beyond Korea. So I said, what? She said, at the moment, India has got nuclear weapons, Pakistan has got nuclear weapons, China has got nuclear weapons. If we allow, that was her phrase, if we allow the Korean Peninsula to be reunited, she said you should just see the gleam in the eyes of South Korean generals when they think about reunification. Because for them, then, the peninsula will be a nuclear power, since North Korea has got nuclear weapons. And if the Korean peninsula gets nuclear weapons, Japan is bound to want them too. And that changes the whole relationship of forces, politically and militarily, in this part of the world. So I said, so it's not that you're scared of nuclear war, given the history of Japan. It's crazy that they would want them, but you're probably right. And, but also I said, if the Japanese got nuclear weapons, appalling though it would be, it would nonetheless release them from being occupied by you since the Second World War. And they would probably ask you to get out of Okinawa. And might that not be a reason? She said, that's your opinion. I said, it is my opinion. But what struck me was that they do think about these things, except not in front of the children, i.e. their own citizens, but in private with people, they feel they can talk to. And Edward was excellent in debating them. I mean, he debated Caspar Weinberger at the Oxford Union on world politics and European disarmament, and was just in sort of fine form, really. So that's the first Edward, the Edward who is not just an intellectual, Edward who is not just a historian, but Edward who cannot stop himself from intervening. He has to stand up correctly, in my view, totally correctly, and speak. Because what is Marxist politics without some form of action? Or what is radical politics if you just sit and open your mouth but don't do anything? And that is what, even, though we disagreed on many things, especially in the early days, that is what made me very, very attracted to Edward as a human being, as a scholar, and as an activist. And as many of you will recall, he was a very, very effective and brilliant speaker, witty, sarcastic, vicious, all the different tones, depending on who he was attacking, which sometimes could be people within the left who got on his nerves, which quite a few did. So that is, I'm sure lots of people have talked about him as a historian today, which is why I'm concentrating on his politics. When in the old days, by the old days I mean the late 80s, early and 90s, Channel 4 asked me to do a series of shows, for which I did for a long time, actually. One of my thoughts, and I have to be honest, it's a Channel 4 you wouldn't recognize today. We had a show called Rear Window, for instance, in which basically I talked to whoever I please, and they mostly happened to be pure chance left-wing intellectuals. And I argued, I said, the channel was created for minority voices, and these are voices never heard. And I did a film with Edward and Dorothy. Sheila Rowbottom came down with me to interview Dottie because she knew her work very well, and I interviewed Edward, and then we edited the two together, called Life of Dissent, which I must say, he was in fine form, as was Dottie, and very generous. And the big debate which he'd had with Perry Anderson and the New Left Review, it wasn't forgotten, but it had been transcended. And I asked him, because Perry was very shaken that Edward was no longer writing for the New Left Review. And he thought the only way to convince him wouldn't be by a phone call or a letter, but by writing a whole book on the debates within the left. It's a very, very fine book called Debates Within English Marxism, in which he discusses pretty generously, Edward thought so, the debates between him and Edward Thompson, where Edward was right, where he was wrong. Very generous work, and it had the desired effect. Edward thought it was very good. Dottie liked it very much as well, and that reunited in some ways the New Left, and that's where Edward wrote his piece on exterminism, which started off a big debate, which was later published as a book. So that aspect of both Edward and Perry is quite important, and recently I discovered some private letters of Edward's, which have never been published before, which I'm publishing in the memoir I've just finished working on, so that it will be published in there. And I had a long conversation about that whole dispute on history and politics that the two of them had, and these, debate. Be checked out. So in terms of his original contributions to history, no one has any doubt that he was a major historian. And the making of the English working class is still in print. It's still in print. We're desperately trying to get it for Verso so we can do a grand edition, but they won't release it, Penguin, which is a very good sign that it still sells and has become a complete classic. Now, when soon after the film, A Life of Dissent was made, and one more footnote on that. Edward died soon afterwards. We spoke on the phone. He was in hospital, ill, but he'd watched the show going out live from his hospital bed, which had, really pleased him. And Dottie said when he came home, he said, "I'm glad I did that. I just feel very satisfied. My life was there and I have no regrets." And he had tears in his eyes, because it was during the Yugoslav war. And he had tears in his eyes when we discussed Yugoslavia, saying it's utterly appalling, this disgusting civil war encouraged by the Americans and NATO. And he then recalled his time in Yugoslavia, helping to build the railways for the new state, together with other British socialists at the end of soon after the Second World War. And it was really, he was probably moved because you saw the tears come down his cheeks. And then, he died. And the interesting thing is, Channel 4 then rang me up again. We'd only shown this film about 3-4 weeks prior, and said, could you re-show the film and then organize a debate around Edward's life and thing? So we did. Unheard of. It's only at once I thought was great, but when they won, it showed what the culture was at that time. And today it shows how that culture has changed, that dissent is discouraged, that most of the Guardian is taken up by trashy rubbish about celebs or murders or mass murders or serial killers. Very little serious stuff goes on. Whereas in that period, I mean, a piece from Edward was not uncommon in the Guardian or on television or elsewhere. And I think it's worth noting that. And then Dottie asked me, she said, I'm exhausted, I'm tired, could you organize the memorial, which we organized in, I think some of the people present here were there speaking. We organized it at the Institute of Education in the big hall, and nearly 2,000 people showed up. And to my eternal discredit, I didn't keep a list of speakers I'd organized. So I know many of them, but I've forgotten others, because Dorothy said, I do not wish to be troubled and people ringing me up. So you just do it, and if anyone criticizes it, I'll say it was you, which would be true, I suppose. We did it, and it was a very moving occasion. But the interesting thing I want to tell you about that is Christopher Hill rang me, and I said, you are coming to speak tomorrow, I hope, Christopher. He said, I am. I am in a slight dilemma. So there's a letter from Edward to me, which I'm not sure I should read out or not. I said, I know that problem, but the thing is this, he said, I want your opinion. So I said, okay, could you bring the letter along with you? And you've got lots of other things to say. He said, yes, yes. So we got to the meeting early, and I sat down. I said, now, Christopher, are you going to show me that letter or not? He said, I've decided not to show it to you. So I said, fine. In that case, read it out. And he said, I'm not going to read it out. So I said, Christopher, what is going on here? He said, Tariq, it is the most angry, rude, vicious, unfair letter I have ever received in my life. I said, well, this makes it sound very exciting, Christopher. And I think you should read it out. And I said, what was the issue, for God's sake? I didn't know you two had disagreed violently on anything. He said the issue was that I was taking too long leaving the Communist Party. And Edward was calling me names like, you filthy prevaricator, what are you waiting for? Do you want to be dragged out? He gave me a little summary. So I must be in Christopher's archive, that letter. But he didn't read it, and he didn't show it to me. And it was that side of Edward as well, very radical side where he couldn't tolerate sort of people hand-wringing, because he came out and fought it and said what he wanted to quite rapidly. And then when I was just finishing off my last book, which was on Churchill, I read The Making of the English Working Class again. And I had read it, of course, when it came out. But I reread it this time and it is still an absolutely fantastic read. Because the thing Edward does, which is not so common now, I mean, today many of the historians, writing in gobbets, picking up certain facts. The narrative account is considered certainly by postmodernists, is unfashionable. That's changing now, but still. But the thing that struck me the most reading it on this particular occasion was the fact that Edward, like other historians of his generation, was a master of contextualization, explaining why he was writing, what he was writing, and the period in which this was being written, what else was going on at the time. So his defense of the Luddites, which, was misinterpreted stupidly, he explained what the Luddites were, who they were, why they were behaving like that. And who can blame them? Well, it is something he wrote when your whole way of life is being disrupted like that, and the future doesn't seem that bright. I mean, so that, I think, is one of the lasting qualities of that book. And I have to say, as a friend and comrade, especially in his last years, I do still miss him a lot. And often something happens and you wonder what Ed would have thought of it. And of course, I have absolutely no doubt whatsoever that he would have been horrified by what the Israelis are doing in Gaza. Horrified, because almost unbelievable, as many people are, Jewish and non-Jewish, in parts of the world, at what is going on. So on that somber note, I'll say thanks and very nice to be with you.